For me, it's $120 now to fill my tank. A few months ago, I was on your show, and I think I was complaining about $4 gas. We're approaching $6 gas now. That means that my patients, some of them cannot afford meat. Almost universally, all older patients that I see are worried about their grandchildren and their children's future. Ordinary Americans speaking to them outside of my office are concerned about basic necessities that they cannot afford. Almost everybody in this area, and I'm in a county in Long Island, which is one of the wealthiest in the country, almost everybody is gathering up their shopping duties and going on one run, effectively carpooling, because the gasoline is so expensive. My patients who are truck drivers transport goods across the United States. We're 3,500 miles coast to coast here, and it's $1,000 and above to fill the tank of a big rig. They get 6 miles to the gallon on diesel. And that's why our food prices have skyrocketed. This is a very serious hardship falling on deaf ears. There was a senator from Michigan who was beaming about being able to drive an electric car past all the expensive gas stations to get to DC. And I thought, Marie Antoinette, most of the people in America don't have access to that and are not going to ever be able to afford that. Plus, we don't have truly the infrastructure. Even though I had a hybrid vehicle 17 years ago, this is something that is absolutely unacceptable for the ordinary population. And I've long thought that there is the foundation for an incipient American spring. It's a very scary thought I've had for a long time. I've not written about it, but the ingredients are building. Demonization of one another, severe financial hardship, loss of direction, loss of sense of purpose, some of it beginning in childhood. I was hearing about your earlier speaker, and leadership that's missing in action in so many ways is completely out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans.
Rita.
How much of this is being blamed on the Biden administration? Because certainly the inflation issue could have been foreseen. You can't just pump trillions of dollars and print all this money and not have an inflationary effect. And yet it seems to have taken the Biden administration by surprise.
I can't imagine what they're thinking in Washington, really. And if you just speak to regular Americans, one of the most stunning remarks somebody made to me recently was how outrageous it was the United States was sending $40 billion of aid to Ukraine. And I nearly fell off my chair. We've spent trillions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and not one American has ever complained about that. That tells you the level of hardship. So we do very much believe the country has not been managed well by the powers that be.
It is intermittent.
I live in the country, so that's happened sometimes.
34-year-old Hannah Schall says she can't cut back on formula for her 9-month-old, but the price...
It used to be, $35. Now we're paying $50. So that's $15 in 9 months. That's crazy.
And in Greenville, South Carolina, Schall's fellow millennial, nonprofit development manager Amanda Rice got a rude awakening in December shopping for a used car.
So I didn't realize how expensive it was until I saw the 2021. I was like, hold on, that's around the same price that they're selling the 2015.
A car she needed for her side gig as a rideshare driver.
To tie myself over into that next paycheck because of what's happening in our economy right now.
What's happening is inflation. In economics, more money bidding up fewer goods and services. And right now, COVID inflation. The government printing and doling out more money to prevent a pandemic collapse. COVID clogged supply chains providing fewer goods. Workers afraid to catch COVID staying home, providing fewer services. No surprise that prices have shot up, and no surprise that folks who live paycheck to paycheck, especially the old and young, are the hardest hit.
The cost of living, it's become more difficult to sustain myself.
In Riverside, California, Antonio Najarro said his 2 part-time jobs in retail and for the county were paying less than his pre-pandemic job as a state election worker. So you've been blindsided by the increase in prices?
In hindsight, yes, thinking that I would still be able to get by or manage myself the same way in the past.
In that regard, Najarro, age 30, is a typical millennial.
They're used to stable prices really for their entire working career.
Economist Allie Wolf, herself a millennial.
Really, for the past 15 years, they've had roughly 2% inflation, and that's what they're used to. So costs go up a little bit, but their wages go up a little bit, and so their purchasing power has roughly been stable. And then the pandemic hit, and it really just turned the dynamics upside.
The rise in rent prices. I was just talking about this with some of my friends. Prices in New York City have skyrocketed. Americans across the country are struggling as the prices soar.
Average monthly rents increased by 14% across the U.S. in 2021, and the cost has risen even higher, up to 40% in some popular cities like Austin, Texas.
To make matters worse, economists say rents have more room to grow. Consumer experts expect them to rise by 10% in the year ahead. These higher prices could be a key driver of inflation this year, posing yet another challenge to the Biden administration.
Rent in America is getting more expensive, no matter where you live.
Rent growth has accelerated coast to coast in big cities, rural areas, east, west, south, north, just across the entire economy.
The areas where we are seeing the strongest rent growth are in places like Austin, Texas.
Yeah, so my name is Maria, and I live in Austin, Texas. During the pandemic, a lot of people began to leave, and actually the rent dropped that year by $100. I am due to renew my rent, and there was a spike of $400.
Making matters worse, few of the new homes in construction are affordable.
Rental demand continues to be extremely strong, and the rental units that are being built are the more expensive ones. That is, the higher end ones.
Meanwhile, workers' pay isn't increasing enough to match the new rent.
We had wage suppression for 40 years, and then we have the period now where wages are growing, especially at the low end. And so the question is, how long will that continue?
Experts say the rent increases will have an impact on the economy.
A lot of the monthly expense for the typical household is money that's going toward the rent or to upkeep of the house. So it is a very important part of all of consumer expenditures.
In the most competitive markets, rents are creeping toward record highs. Renters in smaller markets are feeling the squeeze too. For example, one-bedroom rentals in Gilbert, Arizona spiked over 116% in the past year. Meanwhile, rent for a single-family home is growing at its fastest pace since 2005, according to CoreLogic. So how did we get here? One answer is the bounce back from the pandemic.
You saw tech companies, major firms moving to smaller cities, cities like Pittsburgh, Austin, San Antonio, Charlotte. These are cities that really started booming because workers had more flexibility. And when the city starts booming, of course, the rents go up because it's a supply and demand issue.
But the story goes back further than that, all the way back to the Great Recession.
President Obama, are you listening?
This has been building really since the end of the financial crisis back a little over a decade ago. A lot of communities have made it more difficult to build more homes closer to the urban cores. Building materials, particularly lumber, has been in short supply. That's been a problem. Labor, a lot of people left the construction trades in the housing bust back a decade ago. And because of the changes in foreign immigration laws, we have a lot fewer foreign immigrants coming into the country. Many of those folks would work in the construction trades. Also, a lot of smaller builders, they rely on loans from banks. And since the financial crisis, banks, particularly smaller banks, mid-sized banks, have been unable to, because of regulatory changes and other reasons, unable to provide enough loans. So, there's a melange of things going on here.
After the financial crash of 2008, house building stalled. By the end of the tens, renters had fewer options, especially in real estate hotspots.
Pre-COVID, we saw a huge rush to urban centers. Millennials love to live in cities longer. They were actually living there longer than the previous generations their age had because they weren't able to get out and afford to buy homes because home prices were so high. So you had so much demand in the cities.
Then the pandemic hit.
So if you look at some of the high-rise apartment buildings in the really dense central business districts, the big cities, rents were actually declining in the first 12 months of the pandemic.